Welcome to the Deep Dive. You sent us some really interesting material, and that's what we're here for, to dive right in.
That's right.
So today, we're tackling Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations theory. Big stuff.
Big stuff indeed. And we're pairing it with a fascinating opinion piece from Al-Qabas out of Kuwait.
Yeah, that one discusses this constant push and pull between tradition and modernity.
Exactly. So think of this as, your shortcut to getting your head around some pretty complex forces shaping the world today.
We know you're here to learn, so our aim is to cut through the noise, give you the core ideas from Huntington and the Alcabas piece.
Absolutely. We want to connect the dots, focus on those key insights, those aha moments, rather than just drowning you in information.
Okay, mission set. Let's dive into Huntington's central thesis first. It's quite a fundamental shift he proposed for the post-Cold War world.
It really is. He basically argued that the main source of conflict and division in the world was changing. It wasn't primarily about politics or economics anymore.
He became about culture.
Precisely. He puts it very directly. The most important distinctions among peoples are no longer ideological, political, or economic. They are cultural.
So the old East versus West, capitalism versus communism framework, that was over.
That was over. Now, he said the fault lines were based on these deeper things: shared history, language, values, and especially religion, these big cultural blocks or civilizations.
Which brings us to his famous, or maybe infamous, list of civilizations. How many did he identify? 8.
Eight major ones, yeah. He outlines the Sinic, or Chinese civilization, and importantly, he includes places like Vietnam and Korea in that broad cultural sphere.
Right.
Then Japanese, which he sees as distinct, culturally separate from the Sinic sphere.
Right.
You've got the Hindu civilization, mostly India, Islamic, which is huge and diverse, so he notes subdivisions like Arab, Turkic, Persian, Malay.
That makes sense.
Then Orthodox, centered on Russia. Western, so Europe and North America, Latin American.
Which he separated from Western.
He did, yeah, pointing to different historical and cultural factors. And finally, African, where he acknowledges it's maybe less unified, but sees a growing shared identity.
So these are the big players on his world map, defined by these cultural ties. And then he argues the power between them isn't static, is it? It's shifting.
Exactly. That's a huge part of his argument.
Yeah.
He sees Western power and influence, while still very significant, as being on a gradual, long-term decline relative to other civilizations.
Even though others might argue the West is still dominant technologically, militarily.
Right. He acknowledges that view, but ultimately lands on the side of declining influence. It's not a straight line down, but the overall trend he saw was a rebalancing.
And what's driving that? He mentions religion making a comeback, doesn't he?
Yes, very much so. He saw a global trend, major religions experiencing, as he put it, new surges in commitment, relevance, and practice.
Filling a kind of vacuum.
Kind of, yeah. A vacuum left perhaps by fading political ideologies. Religion provides identity, community, answers, things people were searching for.
Now, looking at how the non-Western powers are rising, he draws a really interesting distinction in how they assert themselves. Let's talk about Asia first.
Okay, so he points to East Asia, Japan, the Four Tigers, China, and their massive economic success.
Right.
And he says, look, they modernized, but they didn't necessarily westernize. They did it on their own terms.
Which gives them more cultural confidence.
Exactly. He says they're decreasingly responsive to United States demands and more able to resist pressure from the U.S. or other Western countries. Modernization, yes. Westernization, not necessarily.
Okay, but then he contrasts that with Muslim societies. How does he see their resurgence playing out?
It's different. He argues that in the Islamic world, the assertion of identity comes primarily through a religious revival.
A recommitment to Islam.
Yes. He describes it as embodying the acceptance of modernity, rejection of Western culture, and the recommitment to Islam as the guide to life. So embracing modern tech, modern life, but actively pushing back against Western cultural values.
Interesting. Using modernity, but rejecting Western culture itself.
That's the idea. And he suggests factors like struggling state economies, very large young populations with maybe limited prospects, and authoritarian governments can all contribute to this Islamic resurgence.
So we move from the Cold War's bipolar world to this multi-civilizational picture. And that creates, well, complications.
Big time. This shift leads to identity crises for some nations caught in the middle. He calls them torn countries.
Like who?
He points to places like Russia, Turkey, Mexico, even Australia, countries with strong ties to maybe more than one civilization, not quite fitting neatly into one box.
And countries start grouping together based on culture.
Yeah, there's this tendency to rally with culturally similar states. Think of regional blocs like ASEAN, the EU, NAFTA. He sees cultural affinity underlying those, at least partly.
Okay, so this sets the scene for his most well-known idea,
hmm
the potential for clashes between these civilizations.
This is the core prediction, yes. Future conflicts, he argued, would likely happen along a fault lines where these civilizations meet, especially between the West and, well, others.
Others, plural.
Plural. He even suggested potential cooperation between, say, Islamic and Sunni cultures, united by maybe shared grievances or interests against the West.
On what kinds of issues?
Things like resisting Western pressure on human rights or democracy, concerns about Western military power, maybe cooperating on weapons proliferation, or even shared views on immigration policies.
And he distinguishes between different types of clashes.
He does. There are fault line wars, smaller, often local conflicts between groups from different civilizations on the ground. He often points to conflicts involving Muslim groups and their neighbors here.
Okay.
But then there's the bigger danger, intercivilizational wars of core states. The big one he worried about long-term was the U.S. representing the West versus China representing the Sinic civilization.
And he listed specific reasons why the Islam-West relationship might be particularly prone to conflict, right?
Yes, 5 main factors he identified. 1, Muslim population growth and youth unemployment creating instability. 2, the Islamic resurgence itself being seen as a challenge. 3, the West pushing its values as universal while also having military dominance, which can cause resentment. 4, the Cold War ending meant no more common enemy uniting them.
Right, that makes sense.
And 5, simply more interaction between cultures, paradoxically, sometimes highlights differences and reinforces stereotypes rather than building bridges.
And the tension with Asia, particularly China, that's driven more by power dynamics.
Largely, yes. Asia's economic rise, China's growing military might, it directly challenges the U.S.'s long-standing dominance, especially in the Pacific. Huntington saw this as a major potential flashpoint.
Potentially worsened if China and Islamic states found common cause.
Exactly. He even interpreted past conflicts, like the Soviet-Afghan War or the First Gulf War, through this lens, not saying they were purely civilizational, but that those dimensions were becoming more prominent.
Like how the Afghan War was seen by some as Islam defeating a foreign invader.
Yes, or how the Gulf War was framed by some in the region as Crusaders and Zionists versus Islam and its civilization. Those narratives matter.
He also described the nature of these fault line wars. What are their typical characteristics?
They tend to be messy, often communal, pitting groups against each other based on identity, frequently religious identity. They're usually long, very violent.
Hard to resolve.
Extremely hard, because they're about who you are. Diaspora groups often fuel them from afar. Peace, when it comes, often needs third-party intervention, and it's rarely permanent.
So, looking forward, what's his outlook for the West in this multi-civilizational world? It sounds challenging.
It is. He sees challenges from the outside, these rising non-Western identities asserting themselves, but also challenges from within the West itself.
Internal challenges, like what?
Like maybe an erosion of core Western values, debates about multiculturalism, weakening cultural cohesion. He wasn't necessarily against multiculturalism globally. He said a global empire is impossible, so a multicultural world is unavoidable.
But within the West.
Within the West, he argued, preservation requires a renewal of Western identity, a reaffirmation of its own unique values to navigate this new era.
And his ultimate warning.
Stark. A major clash between civilizations, especially involving the West, is, in his words, the greatest threat to world peace and an international order.
Okay, that's a heavy note to pause on with Huntington. Let's bring in the Al-Qabas opinion piece now. The tension between tradition and modernity. How does this fit in?
It fits really well, actually. It gives us an internal perspective from within the Arab and Muslim world on some of the dynamics Huntington talks about at a bigger scale.
What's the core argument of the piece?
The author argues very strongly that real progress for any society means fully embracing modernity. And that means, well, letting go of certain aspects of outdated traditional identity.
You can't have both.
That's the implication. The piece says trying to embrace modernity while clinging to outdated identities is like wanting to eat their cake and leave it whole, a futile endeavor.
So it sees tradition and modernity as fundamentally clashing forces, not things you can easily blend.
Pretty much. It talks about a fundamental clash of ideologies and ways of life that demands a really deep, all-encompassing societal transformation, not just tinkering around the edges.
Wow, that's a strong stance.
Yeah.
Does it talk about how this affects people individually?
It does. It mentions this inner conflict, this feeling of a fractured existence for people caught between wanting the benefits of modern life, but also feeling the pull of traditional comforts and norms.
Leading to hypocrisy.
It suggests a pervasive culture of duplicity. Yeah. People potentially acting one way in public or modern settings and another way in private or traditional ones just to cope with the pressure.
So how does this internal struggle connect back to Huntington's big picture?
It gives us a ground-level view of the very tensions Huntington identifies when he talks about non-Western societies grappling with modernity while trying to preserve cultural identity like the Islamic resurgence. The Al-Qabas piece shows us the internal debate and difficulty involved in that process, specifically within the Arab and Muslim context that Huntington highlights as a key civilizational actor. It's the internal dimension of those external assertions.
Does the author offer a solution? A way to manage this tension?
The piece suggests that establishing a civil state is key to reconciling these forces and achieving genuine progress.
A civil state?
Yeah.
Meaning what, exactly? Secular. Based on citizenship, rather than just identity.
It doesn't elaborate extensively, but the implication seems to be a system that allows for modern life, rule of law, individual rights, while still finding space for cultural identity, but perhaps separating religion from the state's core functions. A way to manage the tension, essentially.
Okay, so let's try and pull these threads together. What are the big takeaways for you, our listener?
Well, first, Huntington gives us this powerful, if controversial, lens. Seeing the post-Cold War world through culture and civilization, predicting shifting power and potential conflict along those cultural fault lines.
A world divided differently than before.
Exactly. And second, the Al-Qabas piece reminds us that these big civilizational trends have deep internal roots. This struggle between tradition and modernity is a major force within societies, shaping how they respond to the world and potentially fueling some of the dynamics Huntington described.
Hopefully, diving into both has given you a richer, more textured understanding than just reading headlines. It's about those deeper currents.
Definitely. And it leaves us, and you, with some big questions to chew on.
Go on.
Well, thinking about both Huntington's framework and this intense internal tradition-modernity struggle, what factors do you think will most shape global interactions going forward? Where is the real potential for cooperation versus conflict?
What's the role of individuals in all this, navigating these huge cultural shifts?
Precisely. How do people bridge these divides in their own lives and their communities? There aren't easy answers, but there are definitely questions worth pondering after digging into these ideas.
Something to think about. Perhaps even revisit the sources with those questions in mind.